record this. Okay, I started record. Welcome today, everybody. As you can tell, this is a hot topic, and hopefully everybody can hear you. I will tell you, starting out, for those of you who haven't heard before, I had hoped to set this up so people can talk and we could hear each other, but the person who set it up in such a way that it's I guess a panelist mode where you can see me, you can't see each other. So when you talk, you're going to need to, or you have questions, you're going to have to put it into the chat function. So I apologize for that. Today is a very hot topic, obviously. As you know, we give a lot of webinars. Usually we have 50 or 60 people attending. Today we've got over 200 that signed up, and we have a pretty good attendance ratio so far because we're up to 121 people. So there's a lot of information I'm going to be presenting. I will tell you that most of the things I'm presenting are on everybody's mind. There's really not a lot of answers to what we're talking about today, although there are a lot of questions. So most of the things I'm going to be presenting are the facts of what's going on out there. I'll also tell you that we have also a couple of good friends of mine who are experts from around the country who will probably, unfortunately, they can't talk, but we'll jump in and make comments through chat based on some of the things I say, and we'll answer some of the questions. For example, there might be two people here, one from Fannie Mae and one from Freddie. They had said they were going to try and attend, but some of them had meetings, so they might be here. But we also do have a good friend of mine from Washington, Bob Diamond, who I know is here. And Bob's an attorney from Washington who co-chaired with me the National Task Force on Inspections and Building Maintenance. And he also has a lot of interaction with the people at Fannie and Freddie. So I guess in one sense, where, something, I can go to certain people and allow them to talk. So I'm going to go to both Bob Diamond, and the other person who's here is Cliff Treese. Cliff Treese is another good friend of mine. I'm going to allow Cliff, you're allowed to talk, and I'm going to put Bob in here also, if I can find him. Cliff is the one I'm going to mention as part of my presentation, very involved, if I'm not mistaken. Like me, Cliff is the past president of CAI National. And for those of you familiar with CAI's fact book, Cliff is the one who wrote it, and he's very good at making up facts, as I'm sure he would tell you. So they're both here, and Cliff also has a lot of interaction with Fannie and Freddie, and he should be able to answer any questions. Cliff, and if you wouldn't mind trying, and let's see, you should be able to talk now. People should be able to hear you. Let's see, I'm looking for Bob to, let's see, Bob Diamond. We have a very huge audience there. I'll also say that a lot of information, your schedule is for an hour, but I don't have a problem going over a little if we need to answer any questions and to get everybody involved. So Bob and Cliff, you should be able to talk if you want to, and I'm sure you will. So again, use the chat function, everybody, and I think that you can probably see Bob and Cliff, but they're not showing their faces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen so that we can start. Everybody will be getting a copy of this. Oh, I don't want to do that. There we go. Let's see. All right, so you're going to see me up in the corner, and what I'm going to do, if I get this to work right, is we're going to start going through the PowerPoint presentation. Like I said, there's a lot of information here. And first, before I do this, I want to slideshow from beginning. All right, here we go. And now I need to share screen. Okay, so now we're ready to go. All right, so I'm assuming everybody can hear me and can see the screen at this time. If you can't, please let me know right away. I've got the chat, just jump into the chat, but I'm assuming everybody can hear and see me at this point. And I did hear some sound, so maybe Cliff or somebody can be heard. So we are recording, and let's get going because it's 9:35. So I'm going to be talking about reserve studies, structural inspection, and banking inspection requirements. What are they and what are the differences? And as you know, obviously we have a lot of people here, so there's a lot of interest in today's topic. Let's see. My name, just to give you a little background to prove that I might know what I'm talking about. My name is Mitch Frumkin, and I'm president of Kipcon. But in addition to that, I'm past president of CAI National, past president of the Foundation for Community Association Research, which is a national organization. I was president of the New Jersey chapter of CAI and the Pennsylvania chapter of CAI. And in regards to the topic we're talking about, CAI National established a couple different task forces, which I'm going to talk about as part of the presentation. And in order to develop public policy on building maintenance and structural integrity, as well as reserve studies and funding. And I co-chaired that along with Bob Diamond, who's here joining us also today. In addition, CAI published a best practices paper on transition, which really isn't our topic, but I chaired the committee that prepared that best practices paper. And when CAI developed the National Reserve Study Standards, I chaired the committee that developed those standards as well as the RS, the Reserve Specialist designation. So pretty involved in that. There's also a publication put out by CAI if you're ever looking for a way to put yourself to sleep at night. Reserve funds, how and why community associations invest assets. And I was involved in one of the authors of that book. But what I'd like to do is to get a feel for our audience. I am going to put up here a poll. And just to get started, I'm going to, you should be able to see a poll in a second. And all right, so there's a poll just so I can get a feel of everybody in the audience. And if you wouldn't mind, if I'm assuming you can see it, it should be on your screen now, the poll and the questions. Can everybody see the poll that's up on the screen now? If you wouldn't mind, all right, here we go, 5 questions. All right, seems like, can everybody see it? Because nobody's, okay, if you wouldn't mind, thank you. Was that Bob?
Yes, it's up.
All right, thanks. So you can see it. So if everybody wouldn't mind just taking a couple seconds so we could all get a feel for who's in the audience today. And I'll give you a minute. There's 5 questions here, and we'll share the responses with everybody also. There it is. If I know this audience, you're not shy. So we've got right now about 50 out of 133 have answered. So there's a lot of something else's here, whatever that is. And as you're going, you'll see that the reason I ask some of these questions, for example, who's in the audience, what do you do for a living? For example, it's what I anticipated. Most people here are managers. The reason for question 2 is 5 or more attached units. You'll see when I get into the presentation that this directly relates to the Fannie and Freddie requirements. The next question about high rises and the type of building is the high rises. Well, I'll talk about it, but a lot of people consider the high rises to relate directly to the structural inspections, and the age of the building is critical when it comes to structural inspections. So it's kind of interesting. All right, we're up to 111. As soon as we get to about 120, we'll give it another 30 seconds or so, and then I'm going to share the results with everybody. All right, it looks like a few people don't want to answer. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll, and then share the results with everybody. So everybody should see it. So as expected, the majority of people on this presentation are managers. We have a number of board members, a few attorneys, a few something else's, and 5 in attaching unit. That's interesting because 67% of the people here have multifamily with 5 or more attached units, which directly relates to the Fannie and Freddie requirements. High rise is okay. All right. Less than 5 years. And you'll see how the age relates to exactly what I'm going to be talking about. Very interesting question number 5. How many of your buildings required special assessments or borrowing in order to perform repairs? And it looked more than 50% of the people who responded have said yes. So that's I don't know if that's a good answer, but all right. So now we're going to move on to the presentation, and thank you everybody for your feedback. So now you can see who we've got here today. So the reason that a lot of the things are happening in our industry, or all the things are happening in our industry that I'm going to talk about today, are because of the Champlain Towers tragedy in Florida that everybody is familiar with. So there are a few things that are going on as a result of that. And in most instances, as you'll hear me say, it's to keep these problems from happening again. But in addition, in some instances, it's to reduce the risk of the people who are providing mortgages also. So there are a couple of different mortgage lending requirements that have come out from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And you'll see as part of my presentation, everybody's going to get a copy of this PowerPoint, and I've included links to the information and things I'm going to talk about. So you're going to get links and a lot of information. So if you want to download any of the stuff that I'm talking about. So it's Fannie and Freddie have come out with regulations, which I'm going to talk about. And also we've got CAI has been very involved in that. Everybody here, I'm sure, is familiar with the Community Associations Institute. And CAI has done a couple things. When the tragedy first happened, pretty quickly after that, CAI developed a couple of national task forces to come up with some public policies. The 2 primary public policy task forces had to do with building inspections, maintenance, and structural integrity, of which I co-chaired with Bob Diamond, who's on the presentation today, as well as an attorney from Massachusetts, Steve Marcus. And also I was very involved with the Reserve Study and Funding Task Force, which had on it an attorney from Florida, as well as a gentleman named Bob Browning, who's a reserve provider from California. So this is a very interesting book, and it explains everything we talked about. I'm going to touch on a lot of it today also as part of the presentation. The other thing I'm going to be talking about at the end of our presentations is the similarities and differences between the mortgage lending requirements, structural inspections, and reserve studies. And the reason for that, we're getting more and more calls these days to do inspections in regards to, for example, the mortgage lending requirements. And there are overlaps between that and the other type of inspections. So as managers or as board members, one of the things you should consider is consolidating these things if you do have them done. So I'm going to show you the similarities and differences between the two. The other thing I want to mention is that CAI National has a fact book. If you haven't seen the fact book, it's a spectacular piece of information. Cliff Treese, who's the gentleman who's a friend of mine who put this fact book together and updates it all the time, is on the call if anybody has any questions. But if you go to this website, this link, and you take a look at it, you'll be amazed at the amount of information that's been put together, not only nationally in regards to community associations, but for each individual state. And if I'm not mistaken, there's information in there about the types of associations, the age of associations, the locations of associations, all kinds of interesting information. And so you may want to take a look at it. It's an unbelievable piece of free information that you can get on the CAI National website. And Cliff, did you want to add anything to that, or did I cover it? Feel free to jump in. No, I guess it's okay. All right. So the next thing is a lot of information is going to be presented. Everybody will be sent copies of this presentation. All the references are provided with links. I guess this foreshadow, I knew this was going to happen. Please ask any questions in the chat. What I'm talking about is presentation right now is evolving. My presentation is the facts as I know it, but they're changing all the time. So I hate to say it because I love to be able to have the answer for everything, but the answers aren't here yet. So I'm going to be presenting a lot of information. And also, I like to kind of talk spontaneously, but there's a lot more writing in this presentation than I usually like to have. And it's because there's so much information. I like when you get this presentation to have the reference material. Now, first, the mortgage lending requirements. Let me give you a little background, because I know that when I first got involved, and I'm starting to hear the name Fannie and Freddie and this kind of stuff, I don't even know who they are. So what are Fannie and Freddie? Or who are Fannie and Freddie? And they are government-sponsored enterprises known as GSEs that were created by Congress. And what they do is they purchase condominium mortgages from their lender partners if the loans meet the project standards. The project standards are what we're going to talk about because they've changed based on what happened in Florida. They also purchase loans for homes in planned communities and housing co-ops, so they directly relate to our industry. So what they do is if somebody comes to you for a mortgage, in order to sell more mortgages than they can possibly handle financially, then Fannie or Freddie may either guarantee or actually buy those mortgages away from the lenders. So they're very, very connected to our industry and what we're doing. They're privately held companies under the oversight of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and they don't lend money to the public directly, but they guarantee third-party loans and purchase loans, like I mentioned a second ago. Lenders rely on Fannie and Freddie to purchase or guarantee the mortgages, as it gives them more liquidity and allows them to underwrite or fund more mortgages, which is what I said a second ago. Lenders need to comply with the requirements to maintain underwriting or funding the mortgages. These requirements are what I'm going to talk about and present to you is what has changed. Also keep in mind, according to FHFA, Fannie and Freddie own 62% of the conforming loans. And so it's a huge part of the lending that goes on. The mortgages in our industry is owned by Fannie and Freddie. That's why it's so important to everybody. And I guess that's why we have 150 people on today's webinar. I will say it's kind of interesting because these days, from a business perspective, more and more communities are asking us for proposals to meet to do disclosures based on what they're asking for. And we were just hired for the first one, for that's worth. But so what are Fannie and Freddie? That's it. And so what is the problem? The problem is that as a result of the tower's collapse, Fannie and Freddie have made changes to their guidance that mortgage lenders must follow if they want them to underwrite or fund the mortgages, pretty obviously. Why are they doing it? Well, first, it's not top of the list, but obviously they're doing it because one of the reasons is to keep collapses and structural problems from happening in buildings by doing disclosures. But clearly, the purpose of the new requirements is also to mitigate the risk of losses to Fannie and Freddie. And one of the things they're also planning on doing, and according to my contacts who may be on the phone, who are on the presentation today, they're going to create a database of condos and co-op projects that are ineligible. Now, it's my understanding that this database, creation of the database is in process. It's not here yet. The other thing is, as I'm going through this, you'll see that clearly it's a work in progress because the Fannie requirements have been in place for a couple of months. The Freddie requirements just came into place, I think it was the end of February. And it's really not fully evolved yet, so a lot of things are going on. The new reporting requirements include, and I'm going to go into them in a little more detail, disclosure of significant deferred maintenance or unsafe conditions, and I'll explain to you what that means from each of their perspectives, any special assessments that are in place, and insufficient reserve funding or no reserve study. So most of these things have changed. I won't say when it comes to reserve funding, Freddie has not really made any changes, although Fannie has. So, but these are the type of things, that's the problem. So I'm just going to show you a couple things. If you go to the links I presented to you, this is how the information is presented by, in this case, it's Fannie. There's a lender letter, LL-2021-14, that you see the title, Temporary Requirements for Condo and Co-op Projects. Then there's also a form 1076, which is the questionnaire that's filled out for Fannie for doing loans. And you'll see in the next slide that they have now added a section to that form, which is, it says questionnaire addendum. If I'm not mistaken, this starts on page 6. And this is where they start asking all the questions in regards to reserves, safety of buildings, all that kind of thing. Keep in mind, these requirements apply to all loans of secured by units and projects with 5 or more attached units. This is the same for Fannie and Freddie. So, but it's based, that's what it's based on. Condos or co-ops, attached units, 5 attached units in a building with 5 or more attached units. So, but now what do some of these things mean? What kind of documentation are they looking for? They need documentation that says, in regards to significant deferred maintenance and unsafe condition, loans secured, and I hate to read it, but I'm going to anyway, loans secured by units in condos or co-op projects with significant deferred maintenance or in projects that have received a directive from a regulatory authority or inspection agency to make repairs due to unsafe conditions are not eligible for purchase. Now, I've taken these directly out of the Fannie requirements, and if you go to the link, it'll show you exactly where it comes from. And I'm going to explain to you in a second, what do they mean by significant deferred maintenance and unsafe conditions? Because that's really the key. And accepted documentation may include a satisfactory engineering or inspection report. To me, it's really not clear is what is the difference between the person who does an inspection report or an engineering report, or a certificate of occupancy or other substantially similar documentation that shows the repairs have been completed in a manner that resolves the building's safety, soundness, and structural integrity. Now, I'm going to jump around a little, but you'll see that if it's a special assessment, which I'll talk about in a second, even if you've had a special assessment to fix things, they will not approve a loan, make it eligible for purchase unless the special assessment work is completed. You can't do it if you just have a special assessment. These policies do not apply to routine maintenance or repairs that a homeowner association undertakes to maintain or preserve the integrity and condition of property. Now, when I look at this kind of thing, as you know, a lot of us live and breathe community associations. I want to keep in mind, this is for condos. There's a mix up in terminology here because a lot of people interpret homeowners associations from the definition as something different from a condo, but this is based on condos and co-ops, so don't be confused by the word. Damage of deferred maintenance is isolated, doesn't apply if damage of deferred maintenance, deferred maintenance is isolated to one or a few units. I don't know what a few units means, or a few units, and does not affect the overall safety, soundness, structural integrity, or habitability of the improvements. So there are some things in which the policies do not relate to. Fannie special assessments. Any current or planned special assessment, even if paid in full for the subject unit, must be reviewed to determine its acceptability. Now, what does that mean? Let me, if the special assessment is related to safety, soundness, or structural integrity or habitability, all related repairs must be fully completed or the project is not eligible. So there's a number of things going on here, and that are certain requirements. Let's see. Now, what did they say about reserves? This is what they say. It used to be that they would say that you need to set aside in your reserve fund 10% of your annual budget, or have a reserve study done in the prior 24 to 36 months, I think it was. I think it's 36 months for Freddie and 24 months for Fannie. But they've changed that. And now they don't allow a reserve study to justify less than 10% of the budget. And they require that the community must have a reserve study in lieu of a condo, which is 10% of the budget. So if you've heard my seminars on reserves, 10% of the budget, not to go my opinion on this, but 10% of the budget can be not necessarily reflective of the community, but 10% of the budget is the guideline they're using, and that's what it has to be. Now let's talk about Freddie. And Freddie is the temporary requirements apply to all mortgages secured, slightly different wording, but secured by units in projects with 5 or more attached units. So essentially the same thing, slightly different wording. But in terms of the questionnaire, if you read in the bottom corner here, it says, I can see it on my screen, in response to industry feedback, Freddie and Fannie are developing Form 476A, an addendum to 476, which is the condo project questionnaire, in order to address these issues. As of right now, Form 476A is not completed. It's in the process. But the Fannie disclosure form, which has the addendum, is completed. And I'm assuming that when 476A is completed, it'll be asking essentially the similar questions to what the Fannie form says, but they're going to be the same form the way I understand this. But the requirements and the reporting and the disclosures are essentially the same. It's just from the Freddie perspective, this form for disclosure of conditions has not been completed yet. But keep in mind, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Freddie requirements only came into place as of February 28th, which is just last week, but they came into place without the form being ready. And Cliff or Bob, please feel free to jump in if I'm not saying anything right. I'm sure you will. All right. Now, what is required from Freddie? Mortgages secured in condo or co-op in need of critical repairs. Now we'll talk about what does critical repairs mean, are not eligible for sale to Freddie Mac. And then similar, but slightly different, acceptable sources of documentation to determine if a project is in need of critical repairs may include, but are not limited to, a homeowners association, again, terminology, condo association or co-op board meeting minutes, engineers reports, reserve studies, list of necessary repairs provided by HOA, co-op corporation, or management company, and other substantially similar documentation. Now, the thing that there's kind of disconnect in some of the things here is that, which I'll talk about in a little while, is that a reserve study does not disclose and does not evaluate the structure of a building. So there's some things that really need to be clarified in these requirements, but there are some disconnects as in HOA versus condo. But these are the things that Freddie Mac has for temporary requirements. Again, similar to what Fannie says, projects in need of critical repairs remain ineligible until the required repairs and or inspection report have been completed and documented. Similar to Fannie, these temporary requirements do not apply to routine repairs and maintenance and damage or deferred maintenance to one or a few units in the project, provided they do not impact the overall safeness and soundness, structural integrity, habitability of the improvements. Now, there's a lot of definitions. I think I kind of skipped over them a little too quickly with Fannie, but it's very similar. So here you've got some forms. What does this really mean? And instead of just typing it, I just copied it directly from. What does a critical repair mean? It's a repair and replacement that significantly impact the safety, soundness, structural integrity, or habitability of the project's buildings, and or that impact unit values, financial viability, or marketability of the project. These repairs and replacements include, now, if I go back to the Fannie definition, my recollection, I think I'm right, is that it stops after significantly impacts the safety, soundness, and structural integrity or habitability, but it doesn't talk about the projects that impact on the unit values. And I guess they're drawing the conclusion that if the building isn't safe, it affects its value. So, but there's different words and additional things added in the Freddie side more than the Fannie side, although it essentially says the same thing. These repairs and replacements include all life safety hazards, violations of local law or ordinances, material deficiencies, or significant deferred maintenance. So now that leads us to the next question. What does significant deferred maintenance mean? And I'm going to, here is the next page, which has the definitions of these things included within these requirements. So material deficiency means unresolved problems that cannot reasonably be addressed by normal operational routine maintenance, which include, again, critical system failure. And keep in mind, which I'll get to in a few minutes, that in some cases, we're not just talking about the structure. We may be talking about, for example, a fire protection sprinkler system, where if there's a fire and it doesn't work, it's a danger. So it's not just a matter in these things of buildings collapsing. So material deficiencies include, all right, and I'm going to touch on this, deficiencies that will likely result in significant escalation of remedial costs related to material building components. I'll touch on that in the future, but also any mold. Now, they really draw the line and say significant deferred maintenance. What does that mean? The postponement of normal maintenance, which cannot reasonably be resolved by normal operations or routine maintenance. and which may result in any of the following. Now, again, there's some confusion in terms that are being used here in terms of deferred maintenance and routine maintenance. And I'm going to touch upon that in the future in regards to what does the industry and what do the standards say in terms of the definitions of the different types of maintenance, but which may result in any of the following: advanced physical deterioration, lack of full operation, increased operating costs, or decline in property value. So these are the kind of definitions that we're dealing with when it comes to these standards. So now, what are routine repairs and maintenance? Often preventive in let me see, my pointer is not going where I want it to go. Okay, here we go. Routine repairs, often preventive, accomplished within the project's normal operating budget, typically completed by on-staff, site staff, focused on keeping the project fully functional. But now they're applying a cost to it. Minor deficiencies with a cost of $3,000 or less, scheduled repairs. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these because you have it in the presentation, but I wanted to give you a copy of what do they mean in their definitions in terms of what will make the loan something that is ineligible based on these definitions. So I just wanted to show you some examples of what they're talking about. And let's see, I'm looking at the chat just quickly, and no comments or questions yet. Oh, Bob Diamond raised his hand. Bob, go ahead. I think we should be able to hear you.
Yeah, the two main takeaways from all of the language that you've just gone through is, first of all, as much as the agencies have tried to define these terms, the nature of interpreting them is left to people who are not at the agencies, people who are not at the lender level. It's the people at the association level. And there's a significant difference whether that person is, a building engineer, a volunteer board member, or a structural engineer who's done a study, or a reserve specialist. So you've got people who may or may not have any expertise answering the questions as to what these definitions mean. And I think that is a significant issue. The second issue is that those people who are responding to these questions and trying to certify they either are or are not eligible are really concerned about their potential liability if they misinterpret or if something bad happens when they've said that everything's in good shape. So I think those are issues in trying to implement the standards that the agencies are trying to impose.
Yeah, Mitch, this is Cliff.
Yeah, Cliff, go ahead. Thanks.
Just, excuse me, one element of documentation that's missing in the list is, in a lot of situations, the property insurer will inspect the building depending on its value, prior to the insurance. That inspection can have a list of deficiencies that the property insurer says need to be corrected either before they'll insure it or sometime during the course of what goes on. I think that could be a helpful tool for any of the listeners on this call if they have that type of report.
Thank you, Cliff. And you can imagine from the engineer's perspective, for example, mine, if people ask me for a proposal to respond to these, they're two different kind of requirements that kind of match, they're kind of different, but they don't, they're not specifically defined. So as Cliff and Bob mentioned, the definitions and the clarity of these definitions, what needs to be looked at is something that I'm hoping will evolve. And, just to comment that before that, I showed you that that form is going to be a consistent form between Fannie and Freddie when it's done, hopefully also means that there'll be consistent and logical definitions that go along with that form. But as you can see, it's evolving, that's for sure. So now what does Freddie say about special assessment? Again, it's similar to Fannie. Any current special assessment, even if the special assessment is paid in full, must be reviewed to determine eligibility, which to me defines it the same as Fannie, which means just because you've paid the special assessment, if you haven't fixed it yet, you're still ineligible. And the seller must also, they also have to determine or understand what the reason for the special assessment is, and does it relate to the safety of the buildings or the definitions we've just talked about. So in regards to reserves, Freddie has not really changed their requirements as part of this in regards to reserves, because you still see here that it is interesting. Freddie is not changing the reserve requirements, and the seller may continue to rely on working capital fund or a reserve study for both established or new condo projects when the project's budget provides less than the 10% replacement reserves, which is essentially what it was before. I will tell you that my experience has been that even if the reserves is less than 10%, and even though it doesn't say it, they generally don't accept it in my experience if it's less than 5%. But they have not really changed this. In addition, it says the seller relies on the reserve study and must validate that the project has allocated the recommended reserve funds. Now you'll see, I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes. How many people have reserve studies done, but then don't fund the reserve study? And it's kind of interesting, which I'll touch on some of the facts about that later, but they're also requiring proof, validation, that not only do you have a reserve study, but you're actually funding it. And the current reserve study must be updated within 36 months. Now you'll see when I touch on a little while, the CAI public policy in regards to reserves says that the reserve study has to be updated a maximum of every 5 years, and the best practice is recommended to be 3 years or 36 months, but it depends on the type of funding plan and other things. But the Freddie even does allow the reserve study in place of just going by the 10% requirement. The other thing is the reserve study must be prepared by an independent expert in performing such studies, such as in CAI, it's the reserve specialist designation, which shows that. Now, when somebody just asked a question, 10% of overall budget to reserves, yes, that's the intention. And if you've been to one of my reserve seminars, 10% of the operating budget does not necessarily reflect the physical assets of the community. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but the 10% of an annual reserve or annual budget is really not a true measure of the adequacy of reserves. But I'm not going to go into that. All right. So what's being done? CAI just recently issued a letter to the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency dated February 17th. If you want to see a copy of it, go to this link, asking them to defer instituting the Fannie and Freddie temporary requirements for condos and co-op projects. Now, in the letter, CAI is not saying we do not need standards like this, but they are saying that it came out so quickly, people are really trying to understand what it means, like everybody who's here today, and what it means and what to do about it and the consistency between the two. So if you want to see this letter, that's the link. As of now, the requirements are still in place. The other thing that's being done is CAI issued a booklet just recently. I think it just came out in the last week or so. And it's a free booklet. You can download it at this website. It's determining a condo or co-op eligibility for mortgages backed by Fannie and Freddie. You may want to take a look through this. It's an interesting document because there's also a number of questions that have gone to CAI about this. And there's a section in there that, of course, it deals with the facts and figures like I am, but there's some question and answer section in there that you may want to take a look at. Although I think most of the Q&A that's in there will be covered in today's presentation anyway, but it's a free document that CAI put out. All right, now let's move on. Does anybody have any questions? Put it into the chat now. If you have any questions in regards to the banking requirements, because I'm going to now move on to building maintenance and structural integrity. Let's see. It's highly, all right. So you can see in the chat, there are a couple of comments made by Cliff and Bob. All right, now let's talk about building maintenance and structural integrity. This is specifically deals with the structural integrity of buildings. And this public policy, which I'm going to talk about, came out as a result of the Florida tragedy and the CAI task force that Bob and I co-chaired. So a little background. When we did this, we did not reinvent the wheel. There are a number of standards out there already. We researched different countries all over the world. And it's kind of interesting. In the United States, there's a lot of cities that have facade inspection requirements. but there's no place in the country except in Florida that has any requirements to inspect the structure of the building itself that the people are living in. But there are other places around the world like that do have standards that are being used. But we do have standards in this country in regards to how to measure it. For example, this is put out by the American Society of Civil Engineers. It's the guideline for structural condition assessment of existing buildings. There's also another publication, guideline for condition assessment of the building envelope. So there's a lot of standards out there that can be used. The other thing we looked at is building safety starts when the building is being built. You don't come into the safety and reviewing the safety after there's a problem. So it starts when the building is being built. And we came to that pretty quickly in developing the public policy. Other couple of things to understand is that a reserve study is a budgeting tool. It is not an engineering inspection. When you read all the articles about what happened in Florida, a lot of the articles, it seems to imply that if this building had reserved properly, none of these things would have happened. That is totally incorrect. A reserve study is a budgeting tool. It is not an engineering inspection. Typically on a reserve study, you don't even include the structure of the building. In order to prepare a reserve study, one of the standards is to have an RS designation, a reserve specialist. Reserve specialist requirements through CAI do not require you to be an engineer, and less than 50% of those who have their RS are engineers. So please don't be fooled into thinking that if you do a reserve study and you keep it up to date and you're adequately funding, that it will protect the structure of your building. It doesn't. The reserve study is based on cyclical replacements of common area building components, such as roofs, roads, sidewalks, and those kind of things. It does not look at the structure. The next thing that we came to a conclusion pretty quickly is that this is not a high-rise problem. The building that collapsed was a high-rise, no question about it, but the public policies are based on the type of structure, not the height of the building. So the public policies are based on multi-family residential buildings of concrete, load-bearing masonry, steel, or hybrid structural systems, such as heavy timber, including podium decks, which I'll touch on there, but very important to remember. It's not just high rises. It's based on the materials. And for all those managers out there, I'm sure you have seen buildings that are not high rises that are starting to exhibit structural problems. So what is a building structure? A building structure is made up of certain parts. It has columns, it has facades, it has balconies, beams, podium deck, parking garage. And the building structure is what holds up the building. So essentially the definition of what you're looking at when you do a structural inspection is the parts of the building that hold it up, the structure or the structural system. And I'm showing two different types of buildings here because it's not only a high rise, but this may be a townhouse building on the right-hand side. So what is the structure designed for? And I'm going to go through this quickly, although I like to talk about this because I'm an engineer, but there are certain things that the structure is designed for. It's designed for the weight of the building. It's designed for the live load in the building. For example, us people in the building are the live load. It's designed for the snow on the roof. It's designed for the wind blowing against it. So it's designed based on the building code for all different things. And that's what the structure is designed for. What is the structural system of the building? The structural system is the structure that takes those weights, the dead, the live, the snow, and the wind, and takes it from hitting the building or being inside the building and bringing it down to the ground in the foundation. So that's what the structural system is. To use a technical term, it's the interconnected, it's the parts of the buildings, the beams and column, which are interconnected to form a path by which the external interior forces, dead, live load, live load, snow load, wind, seismic, are applied to the building or delivered to the ground. So that's what the structural system is. So when you have a structural inspection done, that's what's being looked at. What's a building not designed for? As you would expect, and this is what causes the problem. It's not designed for deterioration due to aging. So keep in mind, if somebody says to me as a structural engineer, design a building, I'm designing it so it doesn't fall down, but I'm not designing it to keep it from aging because everything ages, which I'll talk about. So it's not designed for deterioration due to aging. There are certain structural materials, as I mentioned, that are used for the building. And I'm not going to go into that again, but what is the main cause of deterioration? Anybody want to guess? If you were here live audience, you'd all know it. The main cause of deterioration is moisture. It's the age of the building, of course, but when you have moisture touching pretty much any type of structural system, it reduces the age. You can see I got wrinkles on my face because I stand out in the rain, my hair is turning gray because I stand in the rain. It takes the color out of it. But age and moisture. Moisture is the primary thing that affects the structural capacity of the building. Some people say, or you may hear people say, also environmental conditions. For example, it may happen faster along the coast, maybe because it's salt water, but it's based on moisture. And don't be fooled, because you've heard the comment that buildings deteriorate faster along the coast. That's not true. They deteriorate, but take a look at a parking garage in Chicago, where it has the cars going into it in the winter, with the salt from the roads going into the parking garage. That deteriorates just as fast as any building along the coast. So it's not a geographic problem. It's the conditions of what is touching the building. It may be temperature, expansion and contraction, exposed to the elements, or adjacent construction. Let's say you're building a building next door and you have pile driving or something. It could have caused deterioration. But the primary cause of deterioration in our buildings is moisture. So let's talk just basically about the types of structure you have. And I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. Concrete. It's made of concrete, which is good in compression and poor in tension. And I'm not going to give a whole engineering class on this. If you want, call me. If you know me, you know I love to talk about this stuff. But it's good in compression, it's poor in tension. Concrete, when you look at it, a lot of people don't realize what's inside of it. But you have what's called reinforcing steel. You see here on the bottom, steel reinforcing. That is steel that's put into the concrete, because the concrete is good in compression when you push, but it's not good in tension when you pull. But reinforcing steel is, and that's why you put reinforcing steel in concrete. What are some signs of deterioration? And there's a couple of asterisks here that Bob asked me to include yesterday. For example, if you see cracking, cracking may be a sign of deterioration, but keep in mind that concrete cracks. Shrinkage cracks are normal in concrete. So depending on the type of crack, that's why you need an engineer to look at it. Depending on the type of crack will determine whether or not it affects the structure, the type of crack, where the crack is. But cracking is one sign of deterioration. But again, keep in mind, shrinkage cracks are normal. Delamination, that's where the surface may peel off. Efflorescence. Efflorescence is another one where it's a salty surface, salt type of surface that you get on the concrete. That shows that moisture is traveling through the concrete and it's carrying with it the salts in the concrete. Just because you have efflorescence does not mean it affects the structure. It does not affect the structure, but it is a sign of moisture that causes deterioration, which you can see in the next slide, because what happens to the reinforcing steel inside of concrete when it gets wet? It rusts. When steel rusts, it expands. When it expands, it pops out the concrete. And that's because the water is getting into the concrete, which the first sign may be the efflorescence. The second sign is rusting. The process is, before corrosion, it's a nice round piece of concrete, buildup of corrosion, it expands, and then it pops out the concrete. One of the terms for popping out concrete is spalling. The other thing Bob had asked me to add, which is absolutely correct, more and more buildings, and some buildings in the past, are using what's known as epoxy-coated reinforcing steel. It's steel that has an epoxy on it to keep the water from it, which keeps it from rusting. As an engineer, I will tell you that, first of all, as a purchaser, epoxy-coated reinforcing steel costs more. The other thing is, epoxy-coated reinforcing steel doesn't give you the same transfer of the loads from the concrete to the reinforcing steel. Minor stuff, but I think you're going to start seeing building codes change in the future in some instances to require epoxy-coated steel, let's say in a parking garage, as opposed to using regular steel. What are some signs of deterioration? If you're a manager and you manage concrete buildings, I don't think this is anything that you haven't seen before. These are just pictures of beams where the reinforcing steel has rusted and popped out the concrete. Column, the same thing. And this is my favorite one, balconies. Concrete balconies on high-rise buildings that are exposed to the elements. The water is going to get into the concrete and rust the reinforcing steel. And just think what it's going to feel like if a 5-foot piece of concrete pops out and falls 10 floors. So balconies are not only a structural issue, but a safety issue. There's no question about it, even for minor sections. So, but that's some signs of deterioration for concrete. Now let's talk about steel. Steel has the same strength in all directions. It's not like concrete where it's good in compression, not good in tension. What does steel look like when it rusts? Now, I will tell you, the pictures you're looking at are from actual buildings. I see this stuff every day. Guys in my office see it every day. But look at this beam to the left. That is rusting, and totally the structure of the beam is gone. Then look to the right. This is a combination of a beam and a column. The thing that's interesting that you'll see in buildings when you see this primarily in parking garages is that the steel is covered with a fireproofing, this white material that's covered with, but so you really can't see the steel, but I promise you if it starts rusting, that fireproofing is turning brown and you'll understand something's going on. But keep in mind also that if you're seeing the rusting, the water's been there for a while. It doesn't happen overnight. All right, deterioration connections. Steel is connected together with bolts. This is on the top picture is something we saw in the last few months where the steel is rusting and the bolts are rusting. And in some cases, we've seen it to the point where the bolts have rusted away. So even if the structural steel member is okay, if the bolts aren't adequate, that connection can come apart and it can collapse. Again, this is things you can see. Bottom, another picture of a corroded beam based on rust. Now let's move on to another type of material, masonry. Masonry, this is part of a building weather protection. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with brick. The water gets behind it. It comes out of the weep holes above windows and things. How many times have you seen it where those weep holes are blocked, the flashing isn't put in right, and then what happens? The water gets trapped inside the brick. On the left-hand side, you're seeing that the water gets trapped behind the brick because it can't get out. It rusts the steel lintel above a door. The steel lintel starts to deflect because it's losing its strength. And look what happens to the brick above it. The right-hand picture shows that the brick in this case is attached, in all cases, attached to the building with what are called steel brick ties. Those brick ties may rust out from behind the brick, or there may not be enough of them. And then what happens? The brick falls off. Now let's go through this pretty quickly. Let's talk about wood. Wood is an interesting material. I really like wood as a structural engineer because it has different strengths based on different things. If it has strength parallel to the grain, perpendicular to grain, the strength is reduced if it gets wet or it gets hot, but this is what wood looks like, and that's what the strength is. But you all know what wood looks like when it starts getting water on it. It rots away. And this is what happens. Pretty easy to see, but in a lot of cases, how many times you guys have buildings where the wood is covered and you can't see it? Let's see, somebody said, all right, I'll get back to those questions at the end. All right, the next one is podium decks. What is a podium deck? This is a typical configuration of a podium deck where you have buildings on top of a deck and there may be a parking garage underneath. There's a common term that's used. It's either podium deck or transfer deck. The reason the transfer deck is used is because if the loads from the wind loads or the loads from the building up above are transferred into the foundation, then it's considered a podium deck / transfer deck because it's transferring the load. If it's not transferring the load like this one, it's just a podium deck. But these transfer / podium decks are used a lot in buildings. How many of you guys have buildings where there's a deck over a parking garage or something else that's exposed to the outside and it's exposed to weather? So what happens with a podium deck? Why is it so critical? Going left to right, here's what the deck looks like. Most concrete decks in a parking garage have a membrane on them. The membrane is there because the cars are coming into the garage and carrying with them water and salt and whatever else, and it sits on that concrete. And if there isn't a membrane or there's some other type of protection, it could sit there for a long period of time and get into the concrete and rust out the reinforcing steel, which is what you see in this picture. You see the rust, you see the reinforcing steel. It's deterioration of the deck due to membrane failure. And keep in mind, membrane of your parking garage should be in your reserve study. Middle, failed expansion joint. Why do you have an expansion joint? Because in a building, concrete expands and contracts in and out, depending on the size of it, it will determine how much, and they put in expansion joints. How many times have you walked through a parking garage and you see this? You see where the expansion joint is, but the actual material of this expansion joint is gone. So what happens? Water gets through. But you don't realize what's going on underneath it. I've seen this so many times. On the right-hand side, there are steel beams underneath this expansion joint that are holding up the deck. The water comes through and it rusts out that structural steel. Very, very common problem. If you see a failed expansion joint and water's getting through, fix it. it'll cost you, or replace it, it'll cost you a lot less than to have to replace these structural beams. And I know because I've been involved in a lot of them. All right, now, making the building safe during construction. There's some public policies that CAI is recommending, and more states are coming out with public policies such as this. And I'm telling you, I see everybody still here. I'm going to go past 10:30. There's a lot of information. And if you have to leave in a few minutes, you'll get a copy of this. But public policy requirements at turnover. Keep in mind, the inspections that I'm going to talk about in order to make sure buildings safe are not in place for a transition study. They're not meant to be in place for a transition study. But at turnover, a complete set of architectural and engineering drawings used for construction to retain the building permits should be provided. If there were changes to the structure, an engineer must confirm that those changes still provide structural adequacy. And I'm going to talk in a second about the importance of design drawings. Here you go. Here's a picture of a concrete building, concrete wall, and a concrete column on the outside. Now you look at this and everything is hidden behind it. So is this a column and a wall that has reinforcing steel bars in the concrete? Or does it have a structural steel column encased in the concrete? You'll only know if you have the design drawings unless you take it apart. For example, in this case, this is an actual building that we looked at. We did not have the design drawings. We were starting to see rust. We took it apart and we found out that it's not reinforced concrete with steel bars, but it's concrete encasing a structural steel column. So that's one of the reasons why it's very important to have the structural design drawings, because then you can know what the structure is as you maintain the building in the future. Next thing is, when a builder provides you, is turning over a community to you, the public policy says, generally they say now, provide a reserve study. But now it's going to say to also provide a preventive maintenance manual for the common elements. It should include a maintenance schedule and estimated cost and timing for the maintenance. And the other thing is that the public policy recommends that the reserve study or the preventive maintenance schedule should include the cost of future periodic inspections and reserve studies to make sure it's done, because generally now the cost of these things are not a line item in your budget, like attorney's fees, like Bob, are included as a line item, or manager's fees or accounting fees. Where do you have a line item for most communities for engineering fees for inspection? So the public policy is recommending that that be included. Now, we talk a lot about maintenance, and I mentioned it before. There's a lot of different definitions used in terms of maintenance that people use incorrectly. If you'll look at the standards for maintenance, and I'm just going to present two of them because they're the ones that relate to us, there's preventive maintenance. Preventive maintenance is something that you can plan ahead. If you have things on your reserve study that are going to have, for example, a useful life of 20 years, you want to do preventive maintenance to those components to make sure they get to 20 years. That's preventive maintenance. You're preventing things from happening. But now there's the other term, corrective maintenance. Corrective maintenance is something you cannot plan for. Corrective maintenance is as a building ages, all buildings age differently. But when you go into an inspection and you see problems, you have to do corrective maintenance to correct them, but it's something that you can't plan for. And it's following detection of a problem. So when you go back to the definition of maintenance that was used an hour ago or so, it's different, and it doesn't really match what the industry standard definitions are for maintenance. So keep in mind, these are the two critical types of maintenance: preventive and corrective. Preventive you can plan for, corrective you cannot. What about maintenance and the life cycle? You hear about life cycle costs. This is very, very important to understand. Do not put off doing maintenance. Experts estimate, and here's one of the experts, that between 2 and 6% of your annual operating budget should be spent on preventive maintenance in order to effectively minimize a facility's rate of decay, which can result in corrective maintenance later on when you do the inspections. Very important. The failure to maintain will cost average 30 times more the cost of maintenance, doing the cost of preventive maintenance. So if you're spending 2 to 6% of your operating budget on preventive maintenance, if you don't do it, it's going to cost you 30 times more the cumulative cost of preventive maintenance to fix something. Very, very important. People really need to understand life cycle costs, not just cost. Because how many people say, we're not going to pay for maintenance, we'll just fix it when we need to? Here's the difference and why you should do it: life cycle costs. The public policy requires inspections during construction. There's different types of inspection that should be done. Obviously, if you're looking at a steel building, it's very easy to look at the steel, see if it's the right size steel, see if the bolts are the right based on the drawings. But if you're doing a concrete building, once the concrete is in, you can't see the reinforcing steel anymore. So more frequent inspections are required to make sure that it's being built in conformance with the design drawing. So here, this is an example of exactly what I said. Once this concrete is put in, you can't see that reinforcing steel anymore. So the other thing the public policy recommends is that no certificate of occupancy issue without confirmation of being built in conformance with the design drawings. All right, what's the process for looking at your buildings? The basic process includes a preliminary assessment, which I'll talk about, and a detailed assessment to see the conditions. Keep in mind, if you know that there's problems already, you can skip the preliminary assessment and go right to the detailed assessment. But the preliminary assessment essentially tells you whether or not you go into more detail based on the conditions. So how often you do this? 5 years, 10 years? All over the world, it's different. All over the world, it's too long. For example, in Florida, where the collapse took place, I don't think you had to inspect that building until it was 40 years old. In Madrid, Spain, believe it or not, they have structural requirements for inspecting their buildings, but not until it's 50 years old. Most other places around the world have what the public policy recommends, and it's based on that. So the first inspection for new construction, it's recommended that be no later than 5 years after construction or after occupancy. For existing buildings more than 10 years old, this is a starting point within 10 years. I'm talking about the first inspection. And the reason why the first inspection is important is because it's set up to be what's known as a baseline inspection. Now, I always use that as a comparison to people who go to the skin doctor once a year. What do? They take a picture of things on your skin, and then you go back the next year and they say, has it gotten worse? Has it stayed the same? That's the same kind of weird, but same as a baseline inspection. The first inspection is to go through a building, look at the conditions, document the conditions so that in future inspections, you can refer back to that report and see if things have gotten worse or are the same. When it comes to a structural inspection, every standard you look at says that these inspections should be done by a licensed engineer that specializes in structures. That doesn't mean you can't have somebody else go out and measure the cracks in the buildings, all that kind of stuff, but an engineer is required to review the report, to review the conditions, and to sign off on the report. The report not only includes the condition, but it also includes whether or not any corrective maintenance that I talked about a few minutes ago is required. Also, if the original inspection, this baseline inspection, sees that there are problems occurring, then it will require a more detailed evaluation in the places where you see the problems. This is not meant to be a transition study at all. Keep that, so that's not the intent. What are periodic inspections? All right, you've done your baseline inspection. I talked about when it's new within 5 years, when the first inspection is done. The public policy, which again mimics things that are done around the world, say that once you do the first inspection, you should have ongoing periodic inspections to see if the conditions are getting worse. For buildings that are up to 20 years old, the maximum of these periodic inspections is every 10 years for the first 20 years. But the reason we say maximum is because if the prior inspection says you should come back based on these conditions to re-inspect in 3 years, you don't wait 10 years. You do it when the report says, but a maximum of every 10 years. Once a building is 20 years old, it's a maximum of every 5 years, because what happens is as buildings get older, the deterioration rate accelerates faster and faster. So that's why it's every 5 years. And again, like I said, it's sooner if prior inspection recommends. Also keep in mind, time periods mean nothing if something happens that affects your building. Let's say a truck is driving past your building and hits a column. You're not waiting 10 years to check the structural integrity. You're going to go look at it right now if there's concern about the stability of the structure or the safety of the building. Now, the purpose is to monitor progressive deterioration, as I talked about. It's inspected by a licensed engineer, and the report should include condition and cost for corrective maintenance or the need for detailed evaluation. What are periodic inspections? Here's what it looks like. When you do inspections, again, like I mentioned before, deterioration accelerates, and this is what this graph shows. That periodic inspections aim to identify issues when they become evident, not after they become problems. And it's a progressive problem. Again, I mentioned a few times, These inspections are not part of the reserve study. Don't think they are, and they are not. Preliminary analysis, again, is to look at overall at the entire structure of the building, to look at the conditions and see if there's something that indicates to you that a more detailed inspection should be. For example, if you start seeing rust stains on a certain column, then you're going to recommend that a detailed inspection be done of that place where you see evidence of structural damage. So this is the periodic preliminary analysis, detailed analysis, and again, this is a more detailed analysis of specific locations in the building. Also keep in mind that one of the problems has been that in order to fix something, the board may have to ask the membership based on the governing documents for a special assessment or to borrow money, and it may be voted down. This public policy says that the governing board of the association must have the power to impose a special assessment or borrow funds to make immediate repairs without a vote of the membership. This is, to me, one of the huge keys in the public policy. Also, if there's a safety concern identified, the inspector must notify the local governing authorities. Other thing to mention, I'm going through this stuff pretty quick because we're over time, but I see we still have pretty much all the audience. It's not just structure. There's a fire protection system, emergency generator, emergency lighting. Those are also safety issues. Now let's talk a little about public policy on reserves and reserve funding policy. This presentation assumes you know the basics of reserves. There's certain standards, National Reserve Study standards of CAI, the reserve specialist designation, some facts that this is CAI has done some research and they have found that 60% of communities have a reserve study, 75% have a fund for repair, and 71% support investing in a building reserve fund. But here's the interesting thing, that if you look at the statutory requirements across the country, 9 states require reserves studies. These are the ones. 11 states require reserve funding, and they don't match. So if you look at the green ones, they're the ones that match. But for example, if you look at some of them, like I'll take California, it may require a reserve study, but it doesn't require funding that reserve study. That doesn't mean they don't, but it's kind of a disconnect. And how can you set up how much is set aside in the fund without a reserve study? So it's an interesting fact they're not the same in some states. One of the things you're going to see is more and more states, and if those of you are from New Jersey, it's happening in New Jersey, but there are going to be statutory requirements for communities to have reserve studies and to fund them. What is not included in the reserve study? This is kind of critical. There's actually a 3-day seminar CAI is putting on next week in Philadelphia nationally for managers on high-rise buildings, and it's going to talk in detail about aging infrastructure report, because reserve studies are done differently for different types of buildings because of the things you can't see sometimes. This is also a free publication CAI has, aging infrastructure report. But what does the public policy say? It requires that reserve studies be prepared in conformance with the National Reserve Study Standards of CAI. It requires what's known as a preliminary study be done pre or during construction, which means that the budget for a community before it's built should have a study done based on the design drawings, even though it's not built yet. It requires that the study be updated at the completion of construction to match what was actually built. And I know that this doesn't come as a surprise to you, but it's very rare, if ever, that what's actually built matches exactly what the drawings show. That's not to say that it's a defect. It's just hard to build exactly the way drawing shows. It requires periodic updates. The periodic update guidelines are a maximum of 5 years, but the best practices recommends 3 years, but it's totally dependent on the type of funding plan they use also. So not to really get into a seminar on it, but if you have a baseline funding model, it's going to be more often than 3 years. It might be annually. All right, now let's talk about reserve funding opposes state laws. For example, in Florida, the statutes say that you need to have a reserve study done, but you can vote not to use the reserve study each year. So CAI opposes state laws that allow owners to opt out of funding, and it prohibits including periodic inspections and updates in the study. So for example, going back to where is the cost of a reserve study update of periodic inspections in your operating budget, it's recommended that those things that they be included in your reserve study, and they oppose state laws that restrict borrowing. Let's say you have a huge snowplow problem where you don't have enough money. Many communities may borrow from the reserve study to pay for the plowing or an emergency repair or something, as long as they pay it back. It also says that you should have a plan for preventive maintenance and repairs, updates at 3 years, and reserve funding for small communities, even if no reserve study is required. There are certain criteria in there that say you may not need a reserve study for a small community, but you should still fund for it. All right, I'm getting close to the end. What are you as an everyday, as a manager or board member, what should you look for? I always use the statement that you need engineers to tell you how to fix it, but that doesn't mean you as a manager or board member can't tell if there's a problem coming. So if it's steel, it's pretty straightforward. Look for rust. If it's concrete, look for cracking, look for efflorescence, look for rust. Wood, look for deterioration. If the problem is identified, fix it. Now, I love this picture that I've got here. And I took this picture because it shows a concrete beam. To the left, you see the white, which is efflorescence, which means that water is going through it. Step one. To the right, it shows rusting. And that's because the water's coming through it. Next step is rusting. And it's a great example to show that efflorescence is a sign of problems. And when you first see the efflorescence, you should try and correct it, because the next step is deterioration of the reinforcing, which is ultimately going to crack out the concrete. What as a board member do you not want to do? Don't ever do this. How many times have you walked into a parking garage where somebody's put in the parking garage ceiling a blue tarp because water's coming through and you don't want it to drip on a car, but you don't care if it rusts away the structure underneath it? If water's coming through, fix it. That's all there is to it. I now touch a little bit on the differences between the banking inspection report, the structural inspection report, and the reserve study. One of the reasons I put this in here is because as a community, you don't have to do these individually. Now I'm speaking as an engineer, of course, a businessman, that if you're having a reserve study done, if you have certain qualifications, there's no reason why at the same time you can't do the banking inspection report or the structural inspection report. So I'm showing that who's it prepared by? For a banking inspection report, it says engineer or inspector. For a structural engineering report, inspection report says engineer. For reserve study, it says reserve specialist. So if you have somebody doing a reserve study that's also an engineer, there's no reason why they can't also do your banking inspection report and your structural inspection report. But what are the differences other than the qualifications of people that do it? The banking inspection report includes structural and mechanical systems. Structural inspection report only includes the structure, and the reserve study does not include the structure, but it includes the common elements with cyclical lives, which I talked about before. In regards to frequency, the frequency for the banking inspection report is going to be set by the lender. They're going to tell you whether or not you need to report to verify that the conditions are okay. Structural inspection report, I talked about already, 10 up to 20 years, maximum 10 years, 20 years, after 20 years, maximum 5 years. Reserve study, I also talked about that. Now, I just want to mention that there are changes coming. There's no question about it. We're all going to see it. If you're, for example, on the left-hand side, this is a paper that came out of Florida based on the collapse. Florida building professionals' recommendations on what to do next. I think a lot of people in this presentation are from New Jersey. I'm on the New Jersey CAI Legislative Action Committee, and we've been working with the Senate, Senator Singleton in New Jersey. And there's an act out there that's being looked at in New Jersey. It hasn't really gotten that far yet because it's real-time stuff. And here's what it says. Be it enacted by the Senate and General Assembly of the State of New Jersey, the legislature hereby finds and declares that the importance of the structural integrity of residential buildings in New Jersey has become a growing concern for many, especially in the wake of the tragic collapse of the high-rise multifamily housing structure in Florida. In light of these growing concerns, it is appropriate for the legislature to put in place appropriate procedures for inspecting, evaluating, and maintaining the structural integrity of certain residential housing structures within this state. It's on the way in New Jersey as well as other places. I will tell you, we've had a very close relationship in the state of New Jersey with the people putting together this bill, and it pretty much mimics what the CAI proposed public policy is. So what I talked about, you're probably going to see coming in New Jersey, but changes are coming. The other thing that's included in this, New Jersey, is the requirement for associations to do ongoing reserve studies, as well as the requirement for preventive maintenance. For those of you who don't know, just until a couple of years ago, The statutory requirement for builders putting together reserve studies as part of their governing documents said that the reserve studies must be adequate. That's all it said. In the last couple of years, and if anybody wants a copy, I'm happy to send it to you. There's been, it's been totally accepted and approved. It's a statutory requirement now that defines what adequacy is, defines what the builder has to do, defines updating the reserve study, completion of construction, defines everything having to do with reserve studies for developers. And now what's coming is reserve studies for communities. So it's on its way. And now that, let me see, is there anything in the chat that I can touch on? Are you going to give the secret, Barbara's Cliff, did you want to add anything? I'm sorry.
Yes, let me just say one thing. This is not legislative, but I think it's a good best practice. And we all ought to start doing it because managers who are on this call, a lot of them are involved in establishing the budgets for new communities, and the lawyers are as well. When you do a new community budget, you've got a working capital fund because the GSEs require an initial working capital contribution at the initial founding of the association. We should put into that working capital budget the money that's necessary to do that first reserve study and baseline structural inspection. That way, it'll be on the radar of the manager who takes over that association, and the board of directors will know that they have the funds to get that reserve study and that structural inspection, that baseline structural inspection accomplished.
Thanks, Bob. Cliff, did you have anything you want to add?
No, I thought Bob did a good job. I think there are two large issues which are not resolvable. One is we have a society that's based on consumption, 70% of revenue. So when you detract from consumption, people resist. The other is the disconnect. I heard that word, I think you used, Mitch. You have a 30-year amortized mortgage, but people move in 5 to 8 years. So one of the problems is you get short-circuited. People decide that they're going to be moving in 2 or 3 years, and then all of a sudden, the desire to look after the property in a substantial manner is minimized. And these are not easy issues to resolve.
All right, thank you very much, Cliff. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to put up, if you have, I see that everybody's interested because we pretty much still have the beginning people that were here. I'm going to put up, if you don't mind, a feedback survey. And if you wouldn't mind answering these questions, and at the same time, can everybody see the feedback questions now? You should be able to see it. I hope you can see it. Cliff and Bob, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yep.
And so while you're doing that, the next slide is actual questions and answers, and that's how we're going to conclude. So I opened up while you're filling out this questionnaire, if you don't mind, I opened up the chat box, and if anybody has any questions, please drop them into the chat right now. And I'm looking down, let's see. As you're doing it, let's see, and maybe you need to move on. Okay. How is this being enforced by the agencies? Just the self-reporting? That's a great question, because we talked about, that's from Ron Katz, who's out in Chicago. Because in New Jersey, we had a lot of discussion about when these requirements come into place statutorily, let's say, how are they going to be enforced? And what we came to conclusion is we have to let the state enforce it. We're giving the recommendations, but we're not the enforcing agency. So it's a great question. How is it going to be enforced? We are by legal definition HOA and not required to have FHA certification. I think that's just a comment. Let's see. Does this apply to townhouses with 5 or more attached units? It does if those townhouses are condominiums. So if you're in a multifamily community, 5 or more attached units, all these guidelines for the banking are based on 5 or more attached units in a condo or a co-op. I am already experiencing lenders requesting information about reserve studies, instruction information across the board, even in HOAs and townhomes. I would say be ready producing information for all your properties, even if the answer is does not apply. Okay, that's a statement. Then Bob Diamond said, so far only imposed their standards on condos and co-ops. And exactly what we had talked about before, the confusion arises because they refer to condos and co-ops as HOAs. Somebody needs to, I guess, explain to them definitionally how to put it and not to mix definitions. Let's see. In the expansion joint example, if the board is in the process of having repaired, is it considered deferred maintenance if the building is not at the point of structural deterioration? Now, good question. I mean, there's a lot of different gray areas here. And if you have in your reserve study, for example, a new membrane, I wouldn't have a problem of taking the cost of the expansion joint out of the membrane cost. And one of the things we've started to do, or we're trying to do, is when we put in the membrane for a parking garage in our reserve study, to separate out the expansion joint so they jump out of it. Are you going to give the secret code at 10:30? I apologize to everybody, but this came so quickly. We did not have time to get CAI certification in this class, but I promise you, if you're here, you're certified. Gary Mursky from Florida. How are concrete piles evaluated, especially in seawater environment? Gary, that's a great question. I know that's something that Cliff always makes comments on, and Bob, but unfortunately, concrete piles, you can't see them. They're under the building. So it's a great question. When you do structural evaluations, you do look for settlement of the building and those type of things, which may be indicative, but it's unless you start doing real testing, which can be done. There are tests that you can do. If you can't see it, you can't comment on it unless you test on it. Gary will have to hire a diving company. A diving company, keep in mind, only if those piles are something that can be seen under the water. In many, many cases, piles are used and you can't see them, they go directly into the ground. So John says, I can see it. Let's see. Anything else? Thank you, I appreciate the information. Let's drop off my next meeting. Let's see. Great presentation. All right. So I'm going to thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I'm still curious about the 10% requirement. Is the 10% of budget or 10% of the value of the property? Good question. It's based on 10% of the budget. I will tell you, a lot of times when we do reserve studies, somebody asks for how does the 10% rule fit in? We say from a banking requirement, it's 10% of the budget. I was on a call with the association last night where they want to know if they met the banking requirements based on 10% of their annual budget. But I always make the argument that 10% of the annual budget doesn't reflect on the building, but in your reserve study, you see the total replacement cost of everything. And in some cases, we'll say, use for your threshold 10% of the replacement cost or 5% of the replacement cost, because 10% of the budget really doesn't say anything. You could have two communities right next door to each other, the same budget and totally different amenities. So 10% of the budget is the same, but the amount they need for reserves is totally different. So you have to be very careful about it. It's a great point. Let's see. I manage a 55 to 91 unit mid-rise. Don't think we have area structural inspection all the way to reserve studies. How do I start seeking specs for the RFP for structural inspection? Call me, okay, or email me. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results so everybody can see it. Also, people like the presentation. Okay, that's good. All right, well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I really appreciate it. We'll be sending out copies of this presentation to everybody. I appreciate you staying on for 23 minutes longer. I blame that on Bob and Cliff for talking too much as they usually do. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day. And you'll be getting invites for upcoming presentations in the future from Kipcon. So thank you very much. Take care.